we're clothes in the river.
Hello, Internet. I'm so excited to be spending this little chunk of time, a slice in the life with Beth Leventhal. And we are here to honor and celebrate the fact that I will be performing the Paint the Town on May 28th at the Masso Studio in Boston. Woohoo! We're going to be raising a lot of money for this amazing organization, and I'm excited to be here in conversation with you to tell people a little bit more about what it's all about because I just think you're a badass and people should hear about this organization.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for being part of this event and supporting the work. It's really important and great.
I'm so excited. I love it. Your people at the organization reached out to me and I was like, why have I never heard of this? It's so cool. So let's tell the people what's up. Can you start off by introducing yourself with your name, your pronouns, and just a little bit about when and why you started the network, Lored, in 1989?
Sure. Yeah. So Beth Leventhal, she, her, hers. So we started in April of 1989. And it was a long time coming. I started doing domestic violence work in 1986. And that's how I realized that I was being abused by my then girlfriend.
Mm.
Because I started hearing my life coming out of the mouths of these straight cis women who were in support groups and in shelter and stuff. Um, and I was super lucky because I had roommates, one of whom worked in an abusers program and the other who was also a survivor. And that's where I got my support. Because if I had said anything at work, I would have been fired because you weren't allowed to be currently abused and work at a program. So I had built-in support at home and, even was able to leave her and um, eventually started a support group for, at that point, battered lesbians or women battered by women at the program that I was working at. And also started working within the state coalition to try to address on a much more sort of systemic level services for um, survivors, outside of the mainstream in terms of sexual orientation. And um, it really ended up being sort of one story too many from a survivor in support group, a woman who had several kids who got thrown out of shelter because she brought up, even though she hadn't come out in the shelter, she brought up to staff that she was experiencing homophobia. And they asked her to leave because clearly she was making the other women uncomfortable. And I was just like, no, like not one more of these, because that was so typical of what happened. If people were largely refused services, and if they were allowed into services, they couldn't come out. And if they experienced any kind of oppression stuff, then they were the ones that were asked to leave. And so wanted to create something that really came from our community,
Mm.
and that could both address the lack of services, or of services that did exist that were specific to queer folks. Um, they depended on one person, and if that one person left or got fired because it was, too much rabble rousing, then the work stopped. And so we wanted to be able to address the lack of services and the lack of commitment on the part of the Battered Women's Movement, and also address the sort of the isolation that survivors felt within their own communities and the alienation that they felt within their communities. Even within community, there was a lot of disbelief and refusal to believe and refusal to acknowledge that partner abuse exists in our
Mm.
communities. And so, folks would hear like, "Oh, it's not that bad. Like, it's not that bad. It's not that dangerous. It's not that prevalent."
Mm.
And, we wanted to be able to say things like, like, no, we are not doing what you're saying, which is sort of pasting this heterosexual model onto our communities. What we are doing is telling you our lived experience. This is what happened to us, and sort of try to break down the again, that isolation and alienation that survivors felt within their own communities, and start to help communities see this as a community issue, not an issue for those poor, pathetic people who are whatever, codependent, low self-esteem, whatever the buzzword of the moment is, that this is a serious issue that affects the safety and health of all of our community.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all that. I feel like if like to sum it up, sort of having if you were just to zoom out, the prejudice is sort of like in a hetero dynamic, you have big, strong, scary men, and you have widow, helpless lady. And I just love that your organization is probably one of the most niche just in the log line that I've ever heard. And niche communities need niche services that are survivor led, which is the coolest thing about this organization too, is that you guys aren't just a whole bunch of people who don't really know personally what this is. I think it gets so intricate in these more nuanced dynamics between people that you need to be able to really dig into what the personal minutia of how we experience these power dynamics and things like that actually are from the horse's mouth first. So I think that's so cool that that is something that you created so long ago. Now, I know that you're all about the work and you're all about this organization, but is there any way we can zoom out a little bit to like the beginning? You said that you started with working in domestic violence situations and trying to be supportive of that. What like initially drew you to any of this work? Like, who was Beth, the person who eventually grew into someone who was making this action happen in the world?
Um, I wish I could tell you that there was this deliberate plan, but I just lucked into the work. Like I had done, I mean, I knew I wanted to do, I had worked on a lot of hotlines, and done crisis intervention work. I was a hotline coordinator, um, and knew I wanted to work with women. And this job at this shelter happened to open up. And so I got lucky and I applied and got the job. And that, changed my life completely.
Hmm.
I owe a great debt of gratitude to the movement for the life that I have today.
I feel like as a younger generation of like so many things being more accessible while also so many like rights and freedoms being taken away, sometimes it feels like a backslide and a
Mhm.
zoom forward. It's always, I feel like there's such an importance in shining a light on people who were there in that like initial movement. And I personally romanticize it a little bit. My lens is that I'm coming from being raised by someone who came out as gay when I was really young. And I, other than finding that out, was like a pretty, like, perfect white picket fence family. Like, I was down to have all the privilege in the world in this, like, hetero dynamic of my family. So at first, when I found that out, I was really unsupportive because I thought it meant, our family is falling apart. And then over the course of watching my mom become who she was in her community, like some of the first older people that I met in my life were queer people that didn't really feel safe in the world to be who they were at all. It really was this niche underground movement. And I feel like people today, really, whether or not they're interested, should get a sense of the texture of that time in the world when, like, there was so much at stake. You couldn't just like upload your pronouns to your Instagram. You really had to like have boots on the ground, and like I just really appreciate you sitting down to have this conversation because I think people should just be hearing from people who did it first. So let's talk more about this organization. What does it mean for you to share power as an executive director at an LGBTQ plus DV organization, and what is that for the people at home who don't know what the DV stands for?
The DV stands for domestic violence. And we tend to use the words partner abuse because it takes the emphasis off physical violence, because there is this misconception that abuse is all about physical violence, and people often think, well, I'm not dead, or I haven't gone to the hospital, so it must not
Mhm.
be real. So we
Mhm.
would really try to talk more about partner abuse. There's so many ways to answer that because what it looks like is really different depending on the situation, I think. But I think overall, what I would say is sort of like we operate on a set of anti-oppression values, and we make very distinct connections between the dynamics of partner abuse, where one person believes that they have the right to control another, and if they don't get that kind of compliance, then they have the right to behave in violent, coercive, or otherwise controlling ways in order to get that compliance. And that is mirrored in oppression, and you just change, individual to group, and that is also mirrored in imperialism. And so what it really says to me is that we really need to think differently about the ways that we define power, in mainstream American culture and Western culture and probably capitalist culture, we really think about power as being power over, sort of the non-consensual
Take over.
dominance. And again, being the daughter of an English teacher and a grammar nerd, it's all about the prepositions. Like if we don't say power over, but instead we define power as power for,
Mm.
power with, and power to, like those are really different ways of thinking about power. And so um, it's not like, as an executive director, like I have power. Like I don't want to ignore that. The position gives me power. But what do I do with that power? I can't ignore it. I can't act like I don't have it because that's just not helpful at all to anyone. It's confusing. But there are ways to use power that are collaborative rather than dominant, rather than controlling. And so, like when I think about those prepositions, and it's like, what does power for mean? Like power for the work, power with my coworkers, power to move this work forward. It makes me think about the what I believe is an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
That like I don't have all the answers.
Hmm.
Like
It's hard.
I don't even know all the questions. And so if we work together as a full staff, as a full organization, as a full community, like each of us has our own particular experience with something, and so we can join all of that together. We're going to come up with so much better work. Like we're going to have strategies that work better. We're going to have outreach materials that work better. We don't have to do one size fits all because we can break things down into the nuance that
Yeah.
each community and each person deserves.
I can relate to that in a really tangible way. As a songwriter, there's this thing where when you write a song in collaboration with someone else, you have to figure out the splits. And
Mhm.
there's a version of that where you can be like, well, I wrote the first line and I wrote the first line of the chorus, so I'm worth 70% of this song because that's the thing that's going to make it money. But the thing that I do and the thing that a lot of people do, I think it's called a Nashville split, is where if you were in the room for the writing of this song, you get an even cut
Mm.
of the writing of this song.
Yeah.
And I love that idea because even if I was at like a trivia game last night and there were two people who didn't know the person the trivia questions were about, and they were like, I shouldn't have a prize because we won, because we were very competitive. They were like, I shouldn't have a prize, I don't even know her. And I was like, you contributed. Your energy of a yes or a no, or your energy of eating the fries or picking your nose in the corner, like literally we don't do any of these things alone. And I love that as a sentiment. Could you speak to like tangibly what that looks like for somebody who's never been a part of an organization? Like what I do is mostly very alone and freelance. So in your organization, how do you actively share power, and how is that like a core principle of how a day-to-day thing happens?
Mhm. Yeah, that again will look different depending on what the thing is, but like when we apply for funds, like I don't just, pull that out of the air. Like look at, what are staff experiencing? What are, so if we were going to apply for, say, funds for, excuse me, direct services, um, what's most needed? Like what are the things that staff are hearing? What are the things that staff are experiencing as they hear that? So how, not only like what is the work, but how do we take care of the people who are doing the work? Who looks at what I've written? Who looks at, how I've framed things? Like that doesn't just all sit with me. That gets, sort of divided out where
Awesome.
possible.
Love it. Also, you do check-ins before you do hard things. We did a
Mhm.
check-in before the Zoom with the team. That
Yeah.
was adorable. I really enjoyed that. What's something you think everyone should know about partner abuse in LGBTQ plus communities?
Oh my goodness. So many things. Uh,
Yeah, I feel like it's not even something, a phrase I've heard before these conversations, but like I know what it means. But let's unpack it for the people.
well, that partner abuse exists. And it is that bad. It is that dangerous. It is that prevalent. And that it is not about violence. It is about control. And
Mm,
you can be controlling of somebody by being sweet and kind and thoughtful and loving. And you can be controlling of them by being violent, threatening, coercive, undermining, sabotaging. Um, Abusers will use whatever works for them in order to try to control their partner. And you may not know it, but you know people, you know queer and trans people who have been abused or who are being abused right now. And so the question isn't, does this exist? The question is, what do we do about this?
mm. I have personally been in a situation where I got too far into a situation where I felt manipulated, and just I don't talk really openly about it on the internet, but it is quite common, and it happened. And I got to a point where I chose to call a hotline, and had I known of this organization, I would have called this hotline. But even with the one that I called, I got some of the most simple, wonderful, reduced advice, which was that anything could change on a dime, and I really needed that super simple, like totally removed advice in that moment. So,
Mhm.
how for this nuanced thing that you guys provide, like say that I call, or do you work with a script or something like that? How do you find ways to be there for the people who call? Because it is such a hard thing to unpack in the nuance of just power dynamics and,
Mhm.
when you don't even know yourself that you're in a difficult position mentally.
First of all, I'm sorry you went through that, and I'm glad you found support. And I'm sorry you didn't know that we existed.
I
Uh,
know now, and I'm telling
yeah.
everybody.
So we don't have a set script. We train everybody, so people do not need to come into the organization knowing how to do this work. Um, and what we train people to do is primarily listen. And listening sounds like it's this passive thing, but it is so not. It is such an active engagement with somebody else. Because what we want to do is, again, if you think about abuse as being about control, we don't want to tell people what to do because that's sort of, even though it's might be with the best of intentions, it's got the same message that an abuser gives, which is you don't know how to run your life. Good thing you've got me to tell you what to do. And so we don't want to repeat that. We
You're
want
there
to
to
be able to
leave.
say, you know your life better than anybody else. You know your partner better than anybody else. What would you like to do? And how do you feel? And what's the impact of their behavior on you? And we would try to reflect that back to people because a lot of folks are end up being really isolated by their abusive partner. That's one of the ways that they do stuff. Because if the only feedback you get about yourself is from this person who's telling you that you are a terrible human being and nobody will ever love you, and all the things that abusers say, um, you're going to believe that because here's this person that you love and they know you. And so maybe what they're saying is true. And so what we try to do is reflect back what it is that we see and what it is that we hear in order to tell somebody, like, nobody deserves X, Y, or Z, that's happening. And here's what I'm hearing you say. It sounds like you're telling me that you're not happy. It sounds like your partner's trying to talk you out of being unhappy and telling you that you have no reason to be unhappy and that
Mhm.
it's all your fault that you're unhappy if you are, and, on and on, whatever it is that we hear and say, but that's not true. And so then we also try to give information about partner abuse and say, here are the ways that abusers work. They try to control reality. They define what's true and what's not. They undermine. They do, so we'll sort of give people information that lets them decide, like, oh, is that what I'm experiencing? Because that, sort of like what happened to me when I started working in a domestic violence program. Like I heard people's stories and I could tell that that was abuse for them.
Mhm.
But then it's like, oh, wait a minute. That must mean it's abuse for me too. Oh. And so like light bulbs go off just in hearing other people's stories and in reflecting back to people what it is that they are saying, just sort of in a different, sort of, as you said, boiled down sort of way. And for us, the point isn't that people leave or that they stay. The point is that they do whatever it is that they want and they do it as safely as possible. And that's our goal.
Amazing. Ugh. I have so much to say about this. And especially like in kink and polyamorous dynamics, control is a part of the sexy thing, and then sometimes it gets out of hand and becomes a dangerous thing. I know that this organization specifically focuses on kink and polyamorous dynamics, and I'm excited to have this conversation because kink and sex positivity and polyamorous dynamics have been a big part of my life and a big part of what I advocate for a lack of shame around. But I also know that it can get messy and dangerous. So tell me when the organization pivoted to be in support of that specifically.
Well, formally, um, during a strategic planning process that we had back in like 2009 or 10. Um, but that process really ended up being us just affirming sort of actively work that we were already doing.
Cool.
Because we said that we worked with lesbian, bi women, and trans communities. But in actuality, we were also working with gay and bi men. We were also working with folks who didn't necessarily identify as trans, but were outside of the gender binary. We were working because, people in poly communities and kink communities like that crossover is with every other community. Like we
Yeah.
were already working with folks who were poly or were kinky. And so it didn't make sense to ask people to not be their whole selves when they came to us. And so we're like, we need to acknowledge that this is work we are already doing and then do it better and do it affirmatively and reach more people because we are doing it affirmatively.
Yes, I love the affirmation of it within the title. I feel like no organization really says that. And it really defines the difference between domestic violence being physical violence. You're like, oh, it invites people to consider that this is a place because it's a hot, cool new thing for the most part. In
Mhm.
living in LA, everybody's a little bit polyamorous, but it sort of feels like this pressure to like be cool and open. I've had a lot of amazing polyamorous situations in my life with amazing people, but I also have seen a lot of things where people feel like they're just supposed to be open minded and then they end up in tricky situations. So I love that this organization is informative about that and invites people to be like, is there something a little not comfortable for me in this dynamic where I feel the pressure to be progressive or super queer on the front foot of what's happening in the world? Like even in these environments, although we support these like freedoms, things can go awry and people deserve protection. So I love that about this organization. Let's keep this going. TNLR, the network Lared, offers several life-saving free and confidential services, including the 24-hour hotline. We already talked about that, and the telephone-based support groups, and and the innovative transitional housing program. This housing program is one of the coolest things you guys do. When I was talking to the people from your team, I was so amazed that there is such a tangible effort in place for people who are in situations like this. And yeah, can we talk about the safe home versus the rental assistance program and this housing program that you guys are working so hard to sustain for people?
Housing Pathways is the name of the sort of residential component of the work that we do. And so, right, so there's safe home and there's transitional housing. Safe home is a shorter term stay. It's a 3 month stay. Um, and it's really a way for somebody who needs to get out now, whether they know what they're doing next or not, whether they have anything besides the clothes on their back or not. They gotta go. Um, that's what this program does. Unfortunately, it's very small, so we can't work with more than one or two people at a time, depending on sort of what our funding and staffing looks like in any given moment. But it's a way for people to get someplace safe, be able to rest, be able to breathe, be able to think, and not worry, and then be able to plan out, okay, so what are my next steps? What am I doing after this month? And what do I need to do during this month to be able to get to that place? And so that's different from transitional housing, which is up to 2 years of support, and that is um, primarily through we pay up to $1,500 a month towards rent. And with the cost of housing these days, that is not what it used to be. And we are trying to raise funds to be able to increase that to meet, sort of what the changes in housing costs have become. Um, but like we sort of work like Section 8, but without the red tape and the bullshit and without an income eligibility. So we pay the rent. The survivor themselves gets the apartment. Like it's not like we own this building or rent this building and we sort of, have people come into our space. It's their own space, it's their own landlord or their own roommates. They work it out and we just pay the rent for it. So what that means is that, at the end, like people are free to change their living situations during this time, but at the end of the 2-year period, if they don't want to move, they don't have to. And if they've
Cool.
got kids, they're not uprooting them from school and after school and friends and stuff. And people get to choose the community that they want to be in. They get to choose the landlord. So people are able to put down roots. And that is one of the most helpful things for survivors is to reconnect to all of
Mhm.
what they've lost. And then we also, for both safe home and transitional housing, we have advocates who are available to provide individual support, um, whether that is advocacy around sort of navigating various systems that people have to interact with, or sort of support around like, what the hell just happened to me? Like, how do I make sense of this?
1,000%. I think this resource is so cool because if you are in a situation, like you said, the safe home option is just to rip yourself out of thinking that you are fully dependent on this one other resource or this one other environment you're stuck in, gives you the chance to think. And then the fact that it's not even a space they only have for a short while with you, it's something that you provide essentially like a subsidy for them to be able to pay the rent at a place that they can continue staying in is so cool because it, like you said, they're putting down the actual roots that translate. They get to stay there and grow into the next phase of their life while having the resources of the organization. That is such an amazing effort. I've not heard of anything like it, especially not from an organization of your size. I think it's so cool. And that makes me especially sad that this poopy pants government has made it hard in that you guys have lost $150,000 in funds for this housing effort that is such a standalone special thing that you guys offer for such a specific need and niche that this sucks. That's why we're throwing a party. People need to come to the party. People need to throw their money at the party. I'm going to be singing songs. And in general, how can people contribute to this? Like, how is this affecting the people in your organization? This is such a drastic loss, I imagine. Like, what do we do?
Yeah, it really is a drastic loss, and it was completely unnecessary. I mean, we lost about a third of our transitional housing beds. We had 16 spaces, and now we have 10. We've gotten some temporary funding to extend 2 spaces, but it's not for the full 2 years. And so, yeah, and it just was completely unnecessary. This was about the federal government saying, anybody that gets anything that originates federally needs to abide by executive orders that would have meant that we could not work with trans people in any kind of respectful way. We could not have worked with most immigrants. Could not have continued to our work towards racial and social justice. We couldn't continue DEI. And like, no. We're just not going to reapply for
Yeah,
the money.
you haven't lasted since 1989 because you compromised these morals. You have evolved consistently to welcome what the queer community looks like now. So I really respect you standing 10 toes down, losing some of that money, and like we're gonna find a way to get it. This is fun now. We said the sad thing. Let's say the fun thing. What are your hopes for TNLR and how can the people watching help realize those dreams? What's next? You've been around since the most iconic year, the year I was born. Sorry, I know that's a little bit of a read, but I think it's so cool because the world was totally different when I was born and you're still here doing like cutting edge work for queer people. What is next? What's the vision for TNLR?
We did this community needs assessment back in like 2019, 2020, um, that was statewide and looked at for folks who had been fearful in their relationships, was how we defined it. Sometime in the previous 5 years, we asked where did you turn and where would you turn for resources? What are you looking for? What was your experience and what do you want? And that has really guided sort of how we have moved forward since then. We've had to take this break because of things like these executive orders and, the constant constant attacks on our communities, on other communities with whom we are in solidarity. And, it's been a lot of really demoralizing um, work and the environment that is the backdrop for that work. And so we embarked on a very intensive, condensed strategic planning process this year to say, like, how are we going to get through this administration? But even beyond that, how are we going to get back to the work that we were doing and not spend all our time focused on, like, oh my God, what if they cut this? Oh, what if we lose that? How are we going to juggle this? What are we going to do? Like, how do we enlist our community in working with us to address partner abuse in a very different way that is largely financially, um, as well as other ways. But that's, our reliance has been so much on government funding that we have not turned to our community in the ways that we really ought to, and that would, I think, also give our community a sense of ownership of, like, yeah, this is my issue too. I don't need to leave it to survivors to say, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. So, we're really talking about how do we raise the funds so that we can thrive? How do we um, really work to be proactive statewide with a staff the size that we have? How do we expand the staff that we have? How do we expand support for the staff that we have so that people can be in this for the long haul?
Mhm.
How do we reach more communities that than we have been? More, not that we haven't reached people, but we haven't done so to the extent that we ought to. Trans women of color are the group that experiences the most violence. How do we make sure that we are, thinking about every program that we have? How do we insist that as we have been trying to do, how do we insist that trans people not be left out of the picture? How do we insist that queer and trans youth not be left out of the picture?
And I think you're doing the right thing. Like, I love the fact that although the government, because listen, I got a grant to make my record this year. I love a little government money, but at the end of the day, that you can never rely on that. And when you're talking about the amount of money that the rent is that you're able to provide, even with where the organization is now, $1,500 for transitional housing, that can still get you a bedroom in New York City. That is a life-changing amount of money. And to be able to look to the community and just let them know that this resource exists, like, it's also at the risk of like somehow falling into a problematic hole. This organization being specifically for and affirming of people who have experienced kink and poly situations, although that goes awry and can be, people find themselves in abusive dynamics, it hopefully for people started in a very sexy place. So I think this is a very sexy organization, and I'm so happy that you are throwing a party, because I think on the other side of the hard stuff is the sexy stuff. Like, this is a community of people who are living their fullest lives as themselves, and sometimes that like lands you in the fire. But these resources are here for people who have chosen to take the risk of being themselves. So I think it's hot and cool, and I'm gonna start crying. So let's keep talking. This is amazing. I think the people have a sense of what this organization is, and I'm so excited for where it's going to go. And I'm excited for this party we're going to throw. Everybody come. Like I said, invite your rich aunt. This is not a queer person's problem. Okay. Bring everybody. Have them give us your money. You get to ask me a question, apparently, Beth. Are you ready for this? Do you have a script in front of you?
I do. I do
Okay.
indeed. Yeah. So if you were in a nonprofit setting, what position do you think you'd hold? And what personality would you bring to the office?
I mean, is there a role for like a cheerleader? Can I just like come in and be like, hey, everybody who wants a coffee? Like, I'd be like the assistant from Hacks, I think. I'd just come in and say ridiculous things, and then I would low key leave life-changing ideas for the organization on your desk at the end of the day, but nobody would know that it was me. So I don't know what that title would be.
I don't either, but when can you start?
I don't know. I don't know, Beth. I've got this whole career of singing. It's working out. The singing and acting, I hate to tell you, but I would love to come for a day. I think that would make for good content.
Oh my God, that would be so great.
If I just played an assistant in the office.
Nice.
Okay, are you ready?
I'm
This gets
ready.
more fun on my side.
Okay.
If you were in the entertainment business, or like say you're stepping into my shoes for the day, what role do you think you would play in Hollywood? Writer, director, actor, singer? Feel free to get specific. I'm sure you had a childhood dream, right?
Oh man. My one of my kids studied acting and improv, and I've watched him perform, and I'm just like, oh my God, like I am so in awe of the power and the vulnerability and everything that goes into that. I could never do that. Like
You could never improv. Okay, got it.
never
But
improv, never
you're a
perform
big
in
fan
front of
of the
people.
Oxford comma, so that this is I feel like you might be a writer.
No, I'm a grunt person. I am a behind the scenes, like, give me shit to do. Uh,
Okay. You're a PA.
yeah, like in high school, I was either in the orchestra pit or like helping to like hammer together scenery or stuff. But like, and handing props to people, but nothing in front of the camera. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Listen, we need people like you. And I'm glad personally that you're putting your efforts towards protecting the queer community instead of just hanging lights on scrims. Although we love IATSE and we support IATSE. Beth, I've got an organization question for you from the Village Idiot. What is the difference between unrestricted funding and restricted funding, and why do we need whichever one of these is better?
Um, yeah, so restricted funding is often funding that comes from either government or sometimes foundations or corporations that's there for a very specific purpose, and you can only use it for that purpose. So if you don't have anything that, like if work that you do doesn't fit those criteria, a lot of organizations will try and sort of morph their work in order to get the funds instead of holding to the work that they have committed
Mhm.
to and believe in and figuring out something else. Unrestricted funding allows you is funding that comes with no strings attached. And so it could be from individuals, it could be from, there are some foundations and some corporations that will give what they call operating costs, and like you can put that to anything. And the what makes unrestricted funding so important is that it allows us to respond to the actual needs of our communities rather than what somebody else thinks are the needs of our communities. Or without having to do an ocean's worth of paperwork in order to get something done. Like we can just be like, okay, here's this need, let's go do it.
We're serving it right
Yeah,
now. We don't have
yeah,
to ask the government if they think that your issue as a trans woman matters. We get to just take care of you right now. So
exactly.
basically, what you're saying is that's why we ask the community for support, because that is money that we can use to immediately help people without asking a shitty daddy president whether or not he thinks it's worth it.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Love. The Network Lorette is a unique name. You know, a lot of pride organizations are like the center, queer place over here. Tell us about the name for the Network Lorette.
So it evolved. We started off as the Network for Battered Lesbians, and we were thinking Safe Home Network, which because when we first started, our Safe Homes program was volunteers who opened up their homes to folks, and so we envisioned this sort of network of community members that were sort of holding survivors and making this like making literal space for them in their homes. And then we became the Network for Battered Lesbians and Bisexual Women once our consciousness got a little raised there. And then we added trans people. And at that point,
Getting
the line
along.
was getting super long. And so we just sort of cut it down to the network that and we've always provided services in both English and Spanish. So it's got both languages.
I love it. So Lorette is the network.
Yes, in Spanish.
They are the network, okay? Reach out to this network. I have had such an incredible time talking to you, Beth. Thank you for taking this time to sit down and talk a little bit about the history of this organization and how you came to bring this work to the world. And we're going to throw an amazing party on May 28th to get all the people to throw all their cash. I'm going to be singing. There are going to be amazing performances. There's food and stuff. It's a beautiful venue. So everybody come, and thank you again for chatting.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.